Human Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Heyman.
Hello and welcome to Human Nature. With me is one Matthew Geiger. Matt is an economics student that I met back in 2018 who has gone on to write a thesis called The Economics of Suicide that will soon be published in these here United States in the form of an actual book. So say hello to the fine folks. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Adam. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me recently on your show, Vacuous Vocation.
Yes.
Why is your vocation so vacuous there, Matt? What's wrong?
I think the name comes from, I don't know. It was born post COVID, and I just was feeling, well, actually Geigenomics was like a whole economics podcast I did, and then vacuous vocation became like when I was just feeling a bit nihilistic. And I really like the name. I like the alliteration, but it's also influenced by the movie V for Vendetta.
Okay.
Yeah. So I really like the alliteration of the use of the word V or the letter V. And I thought it was a good name because also it is, I don't know, I think the younger generation is a little bit more ironic and can be open to nihilism, not necessarily cynicism, but not taking everything so seriously and being silly. And I want it to pass as something that like is of course super important to me, but is also something that I guess can be like it can have multiple meanings. It can be like art, and I think it's beautiful, but I can't exactly explain why it's called vacuous. Okay.
Well, I'll just assume it's a huge homage to Alan Moore, the guy who wrote the graphic novel V for Vendetta. And yeah, the main character there had this huge long speech where damn near every word started with the letter V. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's my favorite movie, and I love the anarchist.
It's a great one. Yeah, it's a great one. So I want to ask you about your dissertation, your thesis. But before that, I want to ask you about you. But before that, I got to give you a shout out for that sweet picture of that famous little economist you got over there behind you.
Yes.
That is
the
Ludwig
letter.
von Mises. Yeah. Where'd you get that?
I got that at the Mises Institute. They were selling a packet of photos of the famous Austrian economists like Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, Hazlitt, Bastiat, and the other ones I have like in my room, but in my other bedroom. But this one I was like, let's put Mises in the corner.
If they sold you a pack of 12, you could do it like a calendar.
Yeah, that would be cool.
So I met you in 2018 at Mises U. Where were you in 2018? Were you a high school student?
So I just finished my sophomore year of college at Occidental College in Los Angeles.
Okay.
And at that time, my first year, I got to take a course with Professor Daron Djerdjian, who is my professor and mentor. And he offered a course because I was just a libertarian, and some people at the school, it's a very small school, like 2,200 students. Obama went there for a year or two. But they're like, you got to meet this libertarian professor. He teaches Austrian economics, and I didn't know what that was. But I took a course with him that he offered to the first year students called Making Economic Sense, which was essentially what he described his Austrian, his Econ 309 course to be a prerequisite of. And it was essentially off the book of Making Economic Sense by Rothbard, but also The Road to Freedom by Peter Boss, and how a private law personal enterprise society would operate with the private provision of jurisprudence, money, education, security. And so it opened my eyes. And then my sophomore year, I took his course, Econ 309 Austrian free market economics, the Austrian perspective, and that opened my eyes even more. And he introduced me to the Mises Institute and said, you should go to the Mises University. Why don't you? And I was like, okay. And that was a week over the summer, and I made it there, and I didn't know what to expect, but it was amazing. And I met you along with Alex Lewis and Alan Wheeler. Shout out to those guys.
Whoop.
And yeah, and it's been history ever since.
Yeah, that's awesome. Is that where you grew up? Is California?
Yes, I was born in Huntington Beach, and lived there in Orange County, and then I was playing baseball, and so I went to Occidental College to play baseball, to do that, and then I quit after my junior year and got into jujitsu, and with 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, shout out 10th Planet and Eddie Bravo.
Now, look, dude, as cool as jujitsu is, you're sort of taking a step backwards. I mean, you can whack someone pretty good with a bat.
That's true. You're not wrong. Maybe I did make a mistake.
So that's cool. When you went to college, did you know it was going to be economics, or were you just going because that's what you're supposed to do?
I went to major in baseball and minor in everything else but education. But meeting Professor Daron Djerdjian, I really was totally inspired by him. And honestly, whatever he taught, I would have wanted to study because he was just the coolest person in the world. And then with economics, I mean, we got to read over my junior and senior year. We read Human Action together, just me and him. And
Nice.
I got to take 5 courses with him in total, including a independent study. And he really, really put me on this path to studying economics. And then after that, took a year off because I graduated 2020.
It's a rough year.
All of it. But then I went to Spain and I got to do my master's with Huerta de Soto and Philip Bagus and the other professors at University Rey Juan Carlos. And now I'm working on that PhD.
You got to pause there because I don't know if everyone will recognize those names, but that's freaking amazing. What to say you just blithely, yeah. So anyway, I go to Spain and I do my master's under Huerta de Soto.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So the Mises Institute had their supporter summit in Los Angeles in 2019 in the fall, in October. And so me and Daron went to that and it was great. The Sunday there was like a breakfast. And so I went there because I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? It's in LA, like that's where I'm living. So I go to the breakfast and I meet this guy, Ed Fuller, and we're just like hanging out and someone comes up to him and like asks him for his autograph. And that's my litmus test of if someone's like a celebrity, if people come up to them in public and ask for their autograph. But then Tom Woods sits on the other side of me. And so I'm in between Tom Woods and Ed, and they say hi to each other because they know each other apparently. And I'm like, wow. And so me and Ed were talking about studying in Spain with Huerta de Soto. And that's honestly, the idea came from Alan and Alex from Mises University. They're like, you should pursue studying with Huerta de Soto in Spain. And I was like, okay. But
that's true. I remember them saying that to you at breakfast at one point.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I thought they were just, blowing smoke up your butt, but there you went and did it.
It just seemed like the only path to really follow if I wanted to keep studying this. But Ed was like, he said, Jesus Huerta de Soto is, in his opinion, the greatest living economist. And then when I mentioned to Tom Woods at breakfast, I'm like, hey, what do you think about studying in Spain with Huerta de Soto? He's like, the fact that you even know who that is, you're so far ahead. And I was like, wow, like that's a good sign. So the application process was difficult. It felt kind of bureaucratic and difficult, but I made it and I went there. And
I've seen some of your videos. I know you at least speak a little Spanish. Were you fluent before you went, or?
I thought I was taking Spanish in college to like prepare. And when I got there, I felt like I only understood like 20% because
Yeah, it's a whole
Spanish
different thing.
yeah, in Spain it's more formal, but it's also the second fastest spoken language behind Japanese. And so by the end, I felt like I understood like 80 to 90% over those 10 months, but it was just you had to immerse yourself. You had to sink or swim. And it was like I'm not going to sink.
Funny little thing about language. When you don't know it, it's like it's ridiculously fast.
Mm,
But if you just put different languages through an oscilloscope and look at them, they're all about the same speed. I mean, obviously, different people have different cadence, but the languages themselves are about the same speed, and it's your brain that slows it down. When you know it, you hear each individual word, but like the oscilloscope can't. It's just noise, 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 noise.
yeah, that makes sense. That seems how it was.
So our brains are pretty wicked. So you study there, you write this incredible thesis, and now you're in Arizona, right? My old
Um,
stomping grounds.
yes, in Phoenix. Uh-huh. I'll tell you. So and okay, so at the moment, this was my master's thesis, and it's being published with Germinal Van and should come out in the fall. Um, but at the time, it was called our Trabajo Fin de Master, which is the second semester we work on this project, essentially our master's thesis. And when I presented the idea in Huerta's seminar of like what I wanted to study, I said the economics of suicide, and he said immediately, "This is a very important topic, and
Agreed.
if you do a good job, then it would be a great PhD thesis."
Was
And
it? Sorry to interrupt you, buddy. Was it COVID that made you think of that, or what threw that idea in your head?
um, that that question I had asked before, and I jokingly said because I'm masochistic, but I think it was a culmination of things. I think it definitely was partially influenced by COVID. I think my musical taste and aesthetic is really open to like kind of like goth, emo, darkness, and just I don't know if it's unfortunately, but there is kind of like this normalization of suicidality that I do feel, especially amongst my generation, and I thought that's very peculiar, and uh, I think it's influenced. You know, I did this old YouTube video on death where I was discussing how like there could be essentially like two types of effects where like you naturally die, a personal effect or like an external one where let's say like the building falls on you. um that's not due to your like your internal circumstance but your external one. And then I thought that suicide could be similar where you know it's your decision, but um there could also be external circumstances that influence. So, like Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, has been really influential in my research because even in the worst conditions, like living in a concentration camp, you have people that are committing suicide. You also have people that are choosing to live, and so it's very much goes hand in hand with like the Austrian school of subjective value theory
Mm-hmm.
and discovering one's own values for living. So if your
Well,
values are externalized by like let's say you join the military, I've heard people from jujitsu who has like a lot of like former veterans say like they brainwash you. And so
mm-hmm.
you do have to give up your internal values for those of the state. And I think that leads people after the fact potentially to fall into having to rediscover their own internal values and whatnot. But um
Well,
yeah.
I definitely want to talk about man's search for meaning and how that's changed. But yeah, when you first told me the thesis, I thought it was great because, for all this time, we've been talking about the harms to society and the individual imposed by the state. And of course, it's perfectly obvious that at the margin, when harms are being inflicted to a populace, some of them are going to choose suicide if suicide is a thing. But no one ever really talks about it. We don't think about what actually happens on the margin and the worst extremes. And the state touches us negatively in so many different ways. I thought it was a great topic for discussion. So, which would you rather tackle first? All the different ways the state is responsible, or would you rather talk about meaning first? Dealer's choice.
Let's talk about meaning first.
Okay.
I kind of want to there's a few digressions I want to touch upon in relation to this topic. The first I would say is I do think you're right that not a lot of people want to discuss suicidality, which is totally normal and fine. But I think that actually the topic of suicide is a realm for the economists to study and economics to study, because if you leave it in the hand of, let's say, sociologists, they'll tell you it's due to, whatever race issues or any other variable. But if it is that economics, financial anxieties, the cost balance sheet suicide, as Frankl has referred to it as, if these are contributing to suicide, then that's very much a matter of importance for economists to discuss. And so I think that it is an economics matter to that extent. And also, I don't know, a lot of people, they don't want to talk about suicide because they think that someone is just, insane or stupid, or it's immoral. And I think from the Misesian praxeological perspective, Mises doesn't say an action is good or bad. It just, praxeologists can't say that. At least praxeology can only say that people act. Yeah. And so if we're analyzing why people do act in this certain way, then it will have some psychological factors that we have to consider. But it's also demonstrating that people are preferring this to the alternatives, and that requires psychotherapy to choose alternative ends. But it's a praxeological.
No, it definitely is. And I definitely don't think sociologists are going to be able to provide anything but their own ideology thrown all over the subject, whatever it is. A lot of times religious people will talk about it, and when they're not just saying it's a sin, they will say useful things like what's missing here is a sense of meaning. And they'll talk about good old-fashioned values, and that's usually constructive. I'm all for it. But I also think economics has a huge amount to say about where you derive meaning and what agents like the state can do to sap that meaning from you, by making your life just seem like there's no point. My buddy Tyrone, my partner here on Human Nature, he's always railing about the evils of fiat currency because he says it just screws up the ability of the individual to chart the course of his life and find meaning for himself by making the unit of exchange the one half of every single exchange that you make, at least in the market. So let's indict the state. What have they done? What have those bastards done to us?
So going off that, I would say that monetary manipulation is indeed the primary factor of state intervention in society that contributes to more, financial anxiety, desperation, despair, and suicidality than most other institutions of the state in society. And the thesis in one line is of my research is how the existence of the state produces more suicides than what otherwise would occur in a free society. So the monetary system, when you inflate it, it essentially devalues every individual unit of that currency because you're increasing more supply of it, which means that the people who are working and earning and saving money are basically being robbed through that invisible form of taxation, which is inflation, by just devaluing their money. People think like, oh, my home, the value of it is going up, the price of it. No, it just, the money that you have, the value of that is going down. And I think that realization is kind of like essential when studying economics. But
The way I say it to normies when they're bragging about their home price or what happened to gold, I'm like, the value of these things didn't change, man. It's the denominator. It's
right.
the dollar that's wrecked. That's all this is a symbol of.
Yeah. And so the monetary manipulation is probably, causing the worst things we have in society, because it perpetuates the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, the war on drugs, the war on poverty, which don't resolve these things. As Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So you want wars, you want to wage wars on poverty, war on drugs, a war on an invisible enemy, such as a virus. That's ideal. You can militarize society, get people to fall in line, stand 6 feet apart, be homogenized, wear masks. Bullshit. But then it also increases people's time preference. So people, when they're not able to save as much, and in the worst conditions, when like the money is being devalued so fast that people have to go out and spend, people become less patient. And I'm reading, I actually got to run into last fall at the Madrid conference, which I'm hoping to go back this year to present a chapter of my research. But I ran into Professor Guido Holzman, and I was talking to him, and he's like, your research sounds fascinating. Like, I have a new book coming out. I hope it helps. And it's called The Economics of Abundance, Generosity, and the State. And it's really good. I'm also reading his book, The Ethics of Money Production. But essentially, this inflationary type society creates a lot of the other institutions that we don't like. So the neoliberalism and this whole critical theory education, public education system are all funded by this monetary system.
Well, yeah, I want to talk about all of that stuff. But before we get away from the money, you mentioned time preference, and the fact that you can't save, elevates it. And, when we think of human action that is demonstrating a high time preference, it's the people who eat too much or drink too much or jab needles in their arm. And what they're doing is completely disregarding the future for the sake of alleviating some need in the present. And as soon as you told me the title of your thesis, I'm like, well, Jesus, suicide, that's the most high time preference action you can make, right? You're saying this one, we're not only going to not count the future, we're going to end it. There will be no future. And then another thing, it's the manipulation of the currency, particularly in the credit markets, that gives us the boom bust cycle. And one of the most classic visions of suicide in America, is like people throwing themselves out of windows during the stock market crash, that led to the Great Depression, stuff like that. Well, that's all led it, at the feet of the central bank, manipulating the credit supply, creating the boom bust cycle that we just can't escape.
Yeah. If the listeners don't have the sense already, this is a little bit of a darker podcast episode. But I will say there is one book I read before starting my research that has really stuck with me. And I think it definitely inspired my research. But it was called Promise Me You'll Shoot Yourself. And it was a book about 1944, 45 East Germany, where at the end of World War II, the Russians were invading and there was no, troops to defend the German people. So they were just hearing these horror stories of like the Russian meat grinder coming in, raping everyone, killing everyone, burning everything. And so it was a whole book of an epidemic of suicides in East Germany because the families would get together and they're like, okay, like this is it. There was no option. So then you had like moms who were drowning their own children and then would drown themselves, and sometimes they couldn't drown themselves, so they would live with like the rest of their life with like knowing what they just did. And then like there was a lot of cyanide, so families would take the tablet. If they didn't have the tablet, they would have a gun, and they would shoot themselves. If they didn't have that, they would hang themselves. If they didn't have that, they would like slit their wrists. So it was crazy, but it was an epidemic. And so it's like, it's not just an individual thing at that point. And it's like, this came from war. And so my argument is that war, leads to atrocities. It leads people to wanting to like cope using drugs. So it's very much like, yeah, like I'm in the anti-war Ron Paul camp, most definitely, because the effects, not just of blowing up buildings and blowing up people, is also, the people who remain and how that affects them. And it's just quite sad. But
And I assume you subscribe to the theory, as I do, that you cannot get wars of the size and scope that we got in the 20th century without a central bank artificially inflating the money supply, because the populace wouldn't voluntarily pay for it through taxes. It has to be stolen, because no one wants this. No one wants to pay for that.
Yeah, as I believe Lou Rockwell said, it's not a coincidence that the century of total war coincided with the century of central banking.
Yeah, that's total madness. You raised another important point that we can't gloss over. As horrible as suicide is, we cannot say it's necessarily irrational. I mean, I can imagine situations of terminal disease and pain or something where loss of faculties, even where it's not insane for an individual to choose no future rather than a future of misery.
Yeah.
And as a praxeologist, you can't. You just have to take note of the demonstrated preference.
Yeah, I do run into that contention with people, who do think that suicide is like a sin or immoral, where, if someone's on their deathbed and they're suffering, I think it would make sense for them if it was their choice to want to end their suffering, right? Like, why are we prolonging the suffering of some people? And it's not my decision to make for someone else what they choose to do with their body and their life. I can only choose what I'm going to do with mine. And so I try not to like moralize suicide in that regard, because I think too, if someone's thrown into a concentration camp and is being tortured, is it irrational to want to end that? I mean, should they just be forced to endure the torturing? I can't say they should. So yeah, I would agree that there are circumstances. I'm not saying I personally don't say it's immoral. It's just a choice amongst people's value scales. And someone asked me at the I'll just make this point, at the Austrian Economic Research Conference in 2023, when I presented this, he asked, are you saying that suicide is always on people's value scales but just a lot lower? And I said, yes, I think it's always there as an option, but people don't act on it because they don't need to or don't want to.
Excellent.
But if forced into those circumstances, then it would become more apparent.
So we've talked about the corruption of the money and its influence on suicide rates. But you also lay a lot of this problem, because you just can't help yourself, kids these days, at the feet of the Nazis, or rather their precursors, the Prussians, and that filthy, wretched Prussian-style education system Horace Mann and some jerk named Dewey gave to us in the progressive era. So what's wrong with the schools, man?
You know what? Actually, I think the schools may be onto something. I think they might be actually perfect. I think that's what society needs. The issue with the schools is that they are day prisons for children, as Thaddeus Russell has said, and they impose the values of the people in the institution that's teaching onto the children, because, as we discussed, people have values. Institutions that are composed of people have values. So it's whatever institution is providing the education will have their values imposed. Mises says, schools can offer the first 3 hours of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but beyond that, you're getting into history and moral ethics and things of this nature that require values to be taught. And the public education system also homogenizes children. As you know, it's like the industrial system. That's why there's the bell to make everyone like factory workers. It doesn't promote creativity. I think it squanders it. So it's also, as Michael Malice said, the only place where children will ever experience violence in their life. One of the only places.
Yeah.
And we have children committing suicide, children getting bullied. And so we're like blaming the fact that children who could arguably be sociopaths and mean, we're forcing them together, and we're not blaming the system. It's just no. The children are what's wrong. I mean, I'm not saying all.
So you're saying kill all the children? Okay.
Yeah, I like that. Well, babies. That was a joke from Anna Kachian, where she's like, I think babies are like megalomaniac sociopaths, but
they kind of are, right?
You know what I mean? Like children are just children. They really don't have all those critical thinking capacities or the social awareness to, I guess, be cordial. So when they're forced into the system, it makes sense that you know you're gonna have some issues, which is why this whole system of every child waking up at the same time, learning the same stuff, having to read the same book on the same page, is like an essence of socialism. It's a part of public slavery, and it is only contributing to the destruction of these minds. There's no cultivation, but
yeah, it's pernicious. There's the violence problem. You know, you're throwing these kids in these prisons with the most dangerous little youth gangs you can imagine, you know, and there's no way out, save for school choice and other options, homeschooling, which I hope more parents would take advantage of. But the other problems are, the ideological indoctrination by the state. Whoever runs these things is going to feed, the curriculum and the values that the state wants. And the other thing is, it's such a bizarre distortion of the environment that children are supposed to be learning in. It's not supposed to be one authority figure and like 30 kids. It's not how you're supposed to learn anything. You're supposed to be learning amongst a bunch of other people of all different ages and seeing them all interact so you can learn what your role is in a particular field of society. To be, to put yourself in this indoctrination camp for 12 years, it's just bizarre. It's gross.
I will say from the other side, because I'm a fan of Curtis Yarvin, and he talks about it could be problematic to, be isolated and not understand how this system operates. So being in the public education system, which I'm a product of, you kind of learn to navigate it. And that's the benefit of kind of being a conservative in a, liberal, leftist, progressive area, is that you have to learn to adapt to the different social milieu, where leftists can't learn that because it's catered to them and their needs and demands. So there is the benefit of like learning to quote unquote hide your power level. And so that's kind of what
you're not wrong, but I could also throw 50 kids in the middle of the forest, and the few that come out, they are going to be badasses. It doesn't mean there aren't necessarily better ways to get these values. So some people who hear your thesis and love the state might say, it's not that bad. Suicide rates aren't increasing, but you say they are increasing, and by a pretty dramatic level. You want to talk about that a little bit?
So I mean, I wrote it in 2022, and that was the data I was using. And I think well, like Emil Durkheim, who wrote his book on suicide, and I think it was considered like the first sociological work in 1897, would talk about how, times of crisis, financial crisis, there's less suicide because it brings people together. And I think that is, I don't know, like I try not to get into the data and the empirical aspect of this type of topic, because I think it's more theoretical for me.
No, Good point. You did mention data in your piece, but I read it last night, and you wrote it 4 years ago or whatever. Yeah, I think you mentioned something pretty heavy, like a 30% increase since the turn of the century.
Yes,
But don't
there
don't quote me.
are.
I might be misremembering.
So in that aspect, suicide rates are increasing, and I think this has something to do. Like we were talking about how in third world countries there's like less suicides, but their material standard of living may be lower, and I think it has something to do with like that brave new world type of society where if everything's provided, our problems are not that of being chased by a jaguar or predator. It's like much more psychological. You know what I mean? Like the amount of different surgeries we have can essentially replace every part of the human body. The one part we can't replace is the human mind.
Hmm.
And so people are have to learn in these new conditions, like rapidly new conditions and environments, about how to live with themselves and their mind when their physical needs are met. And so, yeah,
Oh, there's another element there. In one sense, what's increasing suicide is what the state is doing to mess things up, to mess our culture up, starting with money and education and everything else. But in another sense, the thing that usually makes people want to commit suicide, absent torture or debilitating disease or pain, is a loss of meaning. And when you are poorer, when we were poor as a species, meaning was sort of right there in front of you. that tiger's about to eat you, or I'm about to starve tomorrow if I can't get food today. So the sense of meaning is just right there in your face. You can't avoid it. You don't have the time to sit on your butt and talk about how you were born in the wrong body or how just unfulfilled you feel. So in one sense, moderns who do live a comfortable lifestyle have to consider that and make a conscious choice, as Ayn Rand might insist, or Jordan Peterson say, to find purposefully what their meaning is. Whereas if you're lower on the socio-economical ladder, your meaning is imposed on you rather than you have to seek it out.
definitely. And so that is a big concern of mine and contention where, like, say I had my ideal and Capistan type society, would would there be more suicides because people can find meaning in like their patriotism or their nationalism? And I'm concerned if that was gone, would some people like really struggle to find their meaning, because like it was these prison like conditions in concentration camps that kind of provided the conditions for Viktor Frankl to like become stronger and find meaning. And so it's like, damn, like if you're free, like what is the suicide rate in freedom? Because there would still be some, but like
Sure.
what about, you know what I mean? So
Well, it's hard to picture because the state has crowded out so many of the private institutions that used to make uh, American society so vibrant, and European society before that. So it's hard for us to imagine what our society would look like if that was gone. But I don't think it would just be a barren landscape of you're skipping through the field and you have no idea what to do. There'd be all these little hierarchies you can climb,
yeah,
from your job, millions of jobs, to the chess club, to associations that are interested in this and that and the other, arts and music. I just think that human beings, without having their foot, on the neck of the state on their neck, I think they just naturally are interested in things. And
mm,
you know it when you found meaning. It calls to you. I
yeah.
think it's a natural condition of our species, absent the the unjust use of force upon us by the state.
Yeah.
You said a line in your paper that really stuck with me. In the cohort of people between 10 and 35, the second most lethal thing to a person is themselves, meaning that
Yes.
in that cohort, accidents are the leading cause of death, and second is suicide, which sort of is obvious if you think about it, but it's also sort of shocking. I mean, you don't expect this age for people to drop dead of, disease, and thankfully murder isn't a huge problem, but for suicide to be number two behind accident, that's disturbing.
To be honest, I may be wrong, but I think the research since then has updated suicide to be the number one but it didn't cause the death.
No kidding.
And I heard that from Dr. K. I forget his name, but his channel is called Healthy Gamer GG, and he works a lot with like people who play video games. And I love his channel. He's a therapist, but also like a Buddhist monk, and that's where I heard about that. But yes, so essentially, yeah, behind accidents, the second most dangerous thing to a person's life is themselves, which is intense. I mean, it means you really have to seriously consider like what is going on with yourself. Like, what are you doing, right? Like, I don't know. Like, it's fascinating, I guess. It's
Yeah, it
concerning,
really is. One of the themes of this show and the Substack that I have, humannature.substack.com, is how pernicious data is, how you really need an operating theory of the world or your discipline in order to understand data. Because a statist would just look at that flip where it was accidents and then suicide, and it flipped and suicide became on top. They'd just be like, well, awesome, seatbelts and bike helmets. I mean, we're really doing a great job, right?
Exactly.
The theory is very important, and always keep an open mind.
Perhaps it is something to do with like, an argument could be made for the drug war, and that like outlawing drugs has led to the increase in fentanyl use and people dying to fentanyl. But I mean, beyond that, it still means that we're struggling with meaning. And I think
That's also a tough one to code, as an overdose, of death, or an accident.
right. I don't know.
I mean, how could you know?
Right. And I think like this is kind of what I want to see more of, is like revealing, as we were critiquing democracy, and like, you know what I mean? Like, it's your duty as a citizen to vote every 4 years. Like, what vote? Like, if it really changed anything, they wouldn't let you do it.
They'd make it illegal. Yeah.
And so I think that like I want to kind of try to undermine and dismantle any meaning that comes with like political identification, because I think it's bullshit, frankly, and I think it is pernicious, and that's really what's vacuous to me. I think, to go back to answering that first question, I do feel some of the most meaning in my life from just studying and discussing these ideas of economics and freedom, and I just want to call it vacuous because we don't live there yet, but I think we will. So yeah.
Well, when I was young, your age, I felt the exact same way about these ideas in philosophy, economics, history.
Yeah.
Then I found an even more vacuous vocation. I played poker for a living.
I will say,
Hold my beer, economics.
I will say, when I was a senior in college, I came across this genre of music, which I always forget what the genre is called, but it's something like it's called like black depressive suicidal death metal or something like that. And then I was like, what the hell is this? Because I was listening to a playlist on YouTube, and I'm like, I gotta see what people are saying about this. So I was reading the comments, and like one of the comments was like, if you listen to this music and read Emil Cioran, who's a Romanian philosopher, 20th century philosopher, if you read his book On the Heights of Despair, you'll have like an existential experience. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try it.
Oh no.
And so there's a PDF online, and I'm listening to this music, and I just stayed up all night at like 3 a.m. reading this book. And it's not too long, but it was quite the experience, and I don't recommend it. But it made me realize, because he was like quite the nihilist and cynic, maybe not so much of cynic, but he's just like, if you're feeling depressed or suicidal, like, just be patient. Like, why rush it? Like, you could always do it tomorrow. Like, you can enjoy this moment. And I'm like, damn, like, that's that's tough. Like, I guess.
That's tough, but I mean, going through puberty and just being young in general is kind of tough,
Uh-huh.
especially for moderns, because we struggle with what the hell are we going to do with our lives, or I did, and for most of us, that's just not that obvious. Like it must be kind of nice when you just know what you're supposed to do. Like my dad was this, and gosh darn it, I'm going to be this. That has to help a little bit, unless you don't fit. But I mean, it doesn't surprise me that teenagers like goth and whatever this new thing is that you just described. That sounds awful.
Yeah. Well, I don't really care for that. I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, my professor Huerta de Soto said the two most important questions in your life are, what are you going to do with it, and who are you going to share it with?
Mm-hmm.
And to that first question, it's like, I don't feel like, at least among the people that I've particularly like grown up with, and maybe I'm being a little bit naive or arrogant, really deeply consider, who they are, who are you, if it's not what you do, and what do you want to do. And I don't know, I'm just trying for myself to like figure out what I want to do and who I am. I still question all the
Well,
time.
one thing to keep in mind is that's not just your job, right? Like
Yeah.
right now, you're doing what you do. And in fact, every second you're doing what you do.
Mhm.
So just your state of being at, every given moment is something to throw into that equation, not just, whatever they're paying you to do. Do you have a feeling? I mean, it's probably hard to tell, but maybe you do. Do you have a feeling whether people your age or younger are like more depressed than you think maybe they were looking back? Or can you even get a
Yeah.
sense of that from your vantage point?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's become like just more normalized and
Mm.
accepted to be like, have this like sort of like, not everyone of course, but I don't know, lately, like amongst the people who I kind of interact with, there is like it's been accepted that, if you know what I mean, someone could be going through something, and that's okay, which is of course okay, and not to like judge someone and try to be a
Sure.
friend, but the fact that so many people are going through something is hard to like cope with, you know?
No, for sure. And it can't help that, like a handful of years ago, it was just normal for people to say it. Are you going to have kids? Oh, no, I couldn't imagine bringing a child into this world. And then they'll rattle off all the horrors of the world. Well, now we've got people being told that there are literally too many people on this planet, and Thanos was right. It would be sure great if we could snap our fingers and half of them all just die. If you're sort of on the margin and thinking, you don't have meaning in your life and you're thinking about killing yourself, it's not really good to get that little earworm in your brain.
Yeah. I don't think my generation, obviously being much younger, considers like overpopulation seriously.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, because we're closer to just being born. So it's like, you know what I mean? It's like a very late stage abortion in my perspective. Like, damn, why don't you die?
24 years. There's
But
still time.
uh, uh, I would say also, like, growing up in this technological age of um, social media literally may connect you to people all over the world, but physically it doesn't,
No,
because physically it's you on your device in
all by
any
yourself.
room all by
Yeah.
yourself. So I think there's less physical interactions today, and I just don't imagine like the the teens and 20s of previous decades and generations being like trying to cope with so much. Like, cuz I see it and I'm just like, damn, like it's kind of it's I mean, it's beyond like sad to me. It's just like it's a product of this environment, of
Yeah.
this like late stage democracy, you know, it's
It's
bullshit. And
well, it's
and
easy to look at the trend and get depressed. Like we're only getting more wrapped into ourselves in the digital world, and Zuckerberg wants us to just put the VR goggles on and never talk to anybody in person ever again. But we have
I
to
mean,
understand that it's a
yeah.
brand new technology, and we just haven't learned to adapt to it yet. We could easily figure out social norms that are much more healthy for us if we choose to. I don't know if we
Yeah.
will or not, but
I mean, oh my gosh. I was a few months ago, I went to one of the Apple stores and tried on like the VR headset because you have to like do like a demo. And anyways, it was amazing. Like it looked so real. It seemed so real. And uh I think people will spend a lot of time using
have
that.
you? Was that the first one you've used, or did you have like an
Yeah.
Oculus Quest?
No, I didn't have the
Because a
Oculus.
handful of years ago, I got the Quest 2, and
Uh-huh.
I was astounded at how good it was.
Wow.
Like I did not think the VR was going to be. Um, I mean, you could put it over these glasses, and the world just looks real. I mean, not
Yeah.
real, but like everything's in the correct perspective. And I
Yeah.
imagine the Apple one was even better. But I'll
It
tell you,
was
I
yeah.
don't use that thing very much anymore. You know,
Yeah,
I got over it.
I think it was very much like it was 8K and it was beautiful and you can like watch a movie and everything. But afterwards there was something that was like, oh, like that was just an experience, an immersed experience. It was like being in a movie theater. Like you get
Yeah,
over it
yeah.
and like you can live without it. Um yeah.
So, you're in Phoenix. Are you getting your PhD in a organized manner at the university underneath the professor, or what are you doing?
So my PhD program is all research and essentially it's just write a 300-page thesis and contribute something new to the field, but you can be anywhere. So I'm like living here, living on my own, working part-time and then doing my studies and research. So there's no classes. It's just read and write and a lot of self-discipline required. And
Hmm.
I have about just under 2 years left, and I'm already feeling the stress, but it's good. As Misa said, doing a PhD is you go through a spiritual metamorphosis. So I'm trying to like accept going through this psychological and spiritual metamorphosis, but it's stressful. And honestly, my research at times makes me want to throw up. Uh, when I wrote it in Spain, just a 50-page one, I felt like I was like blacking out at times just to like cope with, all the parts of my research that I was dealing with. And I think, when you read it, I don't know how you interpreted it, but I feel like you can feel my frustration, I guess. And
Sure.
the one of the best compliments, well, the two of the best compliments I received was from Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto during our defense of it, where he said like everyone should get a copy and read this. And then my professor's mom, Daron Djerdjian, his mom said that I'm a very courageous writer, and that's what I'm trying to bring. And maybe we can link like the PDF version
Sure.
in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Daron. How do you say his last name?
Djerdjian, I
Now,
think.
I got to spell this for the listeners because I met this man at Freedom Fest right before I ran into you again, and this guy's a character. Djerdjian. So is this guy like a terrorist or an Armenian or both?
He's an Armenian. Yeah, he was from Syria and Lebanon, I
Oh
believe,
wow.
and came over to the US, studied at UCLA, and then did his PhD at Syracuse in the mainstream, and then studied and taught in Dubai, and then at Occidental, and just his friend Vaskin introduced him to like Austrian economics, and he just studied it and then was able to offer his own course on Austrian economics and has had since uh, hundreds of students and he taught at Occidental for about 13 or 14 years. And when Occidental was getting rid of him, there was like a whole petition, and like 400 students signed it, even parents of students, grandparents of students, saying like thanking him. Because of him, they can have a conversation with their grandchild, and the student saying, I'm always thinking about what I learned in his class to this day. It was the only interesting class at Occidental. And so he's the GOAT. The students call him the king. Even at UCLA, so now he's doing a summer program at UCLA, and they just offered him a fall semester to teach at UCLA. And then after the first seminar, some of the students said, we love you, because nowhere else are people teaching free market economics to the extent that he teaches it. He teaches, from human nature, and
Yeah.
it's beautiful, and I love it. And so we're just starting the Carl Menger Institute for market economic research, and it's going to be free to students, and we're looking for donors. Please check it out. Let's get it. It's going to be up and running January 2025, and it's going to be me and my professor teaching, and I'm very excited.
No, that's a very exciting project. 1-year course, and it teaches, if I recall the brochure correctly, 10 distinct planks of Austrian economics, and it looked like almost a chapter guide of human action. I mean, obviously
Yep.
there's more stuff, but no, it looked really solid. I did have a question about that. It says what they offer is a diploma. I don't know why I pronounced it like that, in market economics. How would you describe that in the pantheon of all things diploma-ish? Where does that fit?
Well, I believe we want to offer a diploma or something that would allow the alumni of our program to come back and hopefully teach with us. And
Oh, wow.
so that's what we want to get to. I know Peter and Ethan, the other students of Professor Djerdjian, are really, helping him get the institute and the website and the principles up and running. So I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Again, from that brochure, it says they're doing something called anthropoethical economics, which makes me wonder, does the program diverge from what Mises and Rothbard and Menger were doing, or are they layering something on top, or?
Yeah. So
what-
yeah. So the anthropoethics is like we distinguish ourselves in that sense of, Rothbard would say there's natural rights. And I think the distinction is in the natural evolution of rights, where rights have to be discovered in a market process from figuring out what works in a society. Because, you can have different types of rights, but where do they come from and how are they respected is a matter of circumstance for society. So what we're saying is basically like, there's no like divine rights, just like there's no like we talked about, you can do anything. There's no like right or wrong or good or bad in the moralistic sense. It's all a social construct, and the outcome of a free society would be resulting closest to the non-aggression principle. But the non-aggression principle is not an objective moral standard that everyone must obey, because you can violate it. It doesn't come from anything other than a statement. And so we want conditions of a market environment that are conducive to peace and prosperity, but beginning with the first principles of economics and self-interest, rather than a quote unquote objective moral code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I might quibble with it. I mean, I think principles, and we talked about this before on your show, but I think principles are very, very useful. But of course, they are also, in order to interact with the real world, there's got to be context there. And what constitutes a rights violation is just going to vary according to, like, if I've got a Wi-Fi jammer in my hand, and I get in the time machine and I go back to the 1800s and I go up next to you and turn on my Wi-Fi jammer, I'm not hurting you in the slightest. But if I do that, outside your house or whatever, well, now I'm obviously inflicting harms. And the thing that tells me it's harm is not only the context involved with the radio spectrum and what this device is and what your expectations are, why you think you have a right to not have your wavelengths interfered with. It comes from a principle. I'm applying the principle that is valuable to these specific situations.
I mean,
And as you said, the way we get there is through introspection and a free market process of free association and trade and all that.
yeah, to use the word natural, or basically, due to the evolving circumstance of us developing Wi-Fi, that becomes an issue. We have to discover what is appropriately considered a violation of those rights.
Sure.
And so I think even the non-aggression principle falls short of in the psychological sense, because there's such thing as like psychological harm.
Sure.
And
But everything falls short. Like even the concept of property rights falls short. Like we had to invent a property right in in the spectrum of telecommunications. That wasn't obvious to us. But it doesn't mean property rights as a concept doesn't mean anything. It means the context of it is always changing. And that's what theory is for. That's what the common law is for. That's what jurisprudence is for.
Mhm.
But I'm always suspicious when people want to throw away the concept of natural rights just because it doesn't solve everything,
Yeah, so the term of natural rights to me is more meaning the natural discovery process of rights, of protecting your own Wi-Fi signals that
Mhm.
naturally evolves, rather than the use of the term natural meaning inherently sacred or inherently divine or inherently needing respect. I mean, like, those get violated on the daily.
Yeah, I mean, as you just said, that concept often is a portal by which nefarious actors smuggle in their own definition of what they think natural rights are, coming from their particular god or their vision of it. So I acknowledge those dangers for sure. It's like I say in the show all the time, I think human beings have a specific nature. It's objective, and the universe is a specific way. And so there is such a thing as, our natural rights that are conducive to us prospering peacefully, rather than the opposite, whatever negative thing that is. So in your expanding sixfold your thesis into your PhD, are you just going to deepen every section, or are you going to add some new stuff, or what's that going to look like, or do you know yet?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a deepening of the existing parts, but I do want to talk, I think, more on uh, human nature, if I can, the state, monetary manipulation, business cycle theory. Maybe I want to maybe discuss technology, because I don't think I do in the master's thesis, and then socialized medicine a lot more. How, Yuri Maltsov has a good talk called "What Socialized Medicine Really Looks Like," and he calls in the Soviet Union the doctors veterinarians, or that's what people would call them, because the people were like cattle. And I think even in like Canada, they have a big program of like MAID, medically assisted in dying, and assisted
Yeah,
suicide,
yeah.
and dying with dignity. And so they're saying, oh, this is like euthanasia, where people are doing assisted suicide. But I think one can argue that it's murder under the label of suicide. And so you still have blood on your hands. Just calling it assisted suicide is bullshit. Now, of course, there are circumstances, but for the most part, you know what I mean? Like, if you're like, no, I just helped this person die, I assisted in their death. It's like, well, you know, like, if you don't have the resources because you have socialized medicine, so that the market demand for healthcare and health services can't meet the consumers, and then the only way to solve this shortage of services is by putting people to death. It's like the North Korean Kim Jong Il how they said they solved the problem of starvation by putting
Yeah.
people to death. In one literal sense, they solved the issue.
Yep, that'll solve it. Just the way World War II solved the problem of unemployment. I mean, we'll give you guys a job. Many of you will die. No, that socialized medicine thing is huge, because obviously if it's your resources that you're going to decide whether to save your life or not, or make the attempt, well, then your decision is, if you say no, then okay, maybe that's some form of suicide. But if it's the state making that decision, well, how can that be called anything but murder? And the demand for healthcare is infinite by definition. So whoever gets to make the decision as to how those resources are allocated, they pay the piper, they call the tune, and they'll decide whether you get a hip replacement or not. Maybe you're just not worth it to society. How would you like that to be the determining metric? Do you deserve this treatment to fight cancer, or are you just not a benefit comrade?
Yeah, I think that talk by Yuri Maltov, I revisit it constantly because there's a lot there, and how like he would say, anyone over the age of 60 would just be given aspirin for anything. Because, as they said, older people are parasites. They don't contribute anything to society. So there's no need to take care of them and provide them with medical services. So then they're like, just take this aspirin and go home and say goodbye to your family. And then like die. And that's that. And that's just like, so, I mean, it's beyond, it's the most, as Yuri says, socialism is like a socialized AIDS. It's the most deadly disease that has ever come across humanity and society. And that's a product of the state, of statism. And so I think, like, you know what I mean? Like, I've been listening, and I want to know what you think, but like the Zoomers, the Generation Z, like I do hear people of the older generations being like, well, the hope, so like, okay, this is beautiful, because some people would be like, wow, you guys are screwed, and then other people are like, no, like, this is the generation of hope, and like actually seeing through the bullshit that the millennials couldn't. And actually some people are saying that the Gen Z is the most conservative generation.
Yeah, there's
So
some truth to that. The way I frame it is that there's a lot of threads at play right now. Some are white pilly and some are black pilly, and I honestly don't know which is going to prevail. But if you have nothing but despair, you're not paying attention, because the generation that grew up with this is cynical in all the right ways. They might be hardier than we think, and they might be way more conservative and resistant to the bullshit than we think. It's really hard to tell. But I do sort of have a hard on, so to speak, for the human spirit. I think that as bad as it can get under the Prussian model, etc., and this constant left-wing insanity that we're suffering under, I do think that our species is strong. The model was built in a very anti-fragile way, and I think that everybody thinks that the time they're living in is just, the peak of importance, and I guess it is, sort of, by definition, but the fact that everybody thinks that means that we're all wrong. So who knows what the future will bring. But I think if we don't nuke ourselves, and if we're not so stupid as to deprive ourselves of energy, like making hydrocarbons illegal or something, or not building the nuclear plants that we need to build, as long as we don't do something stupid, I think we'll come through this, and it'll just be a hey, can you remember those handful of decades when we all went crazy and woke them? That was sure weird, right?
Yeah, I mean, to the nuclear question, I think you just gotta be optimistic, because I don't know what to do about that. But it's like the
I
Cold
am
War.
optimistic. I think that's turned in this country like a 180-degree U-turn over the last 2 years. So that's good.
Yeah. I think that, my battle, I forgot kind of what I was gonna say. But I guess what I want to say is that, like, when I look at the cynicism of the younger generations, like you mentioned about systems and goals,
Mm.
like, to me, the progressive generation that is living today is like the millennials, who are like the 2010s people who bought all of it, right? Who bought the Obama as the best president ever and stuff like that. And I mean, it's just, again, it's like the goal is like, well, this is our goal, and it's like you just look with your own eyes, and none of it is panning out. And I think the younger generation, unfortunately, has to bear the situation that we're living through, but beautifully can then see that this goal is not working, and so alternative systems are required. And I'm very, very every day more optimistic and hopeful for our generation. Of course, yes.
No, I agree. If they do accept that meme, if it develops in their heads that it's systems rather than goals, then I think the fact that libertarianism has grown and grown and grown in the zeitgeist enough that it should be considered as one of the systems if we decide to throw away, the regime that we're suffering under right now. Because like 15 years ago, even, I would have just assumed that if the currency collapsed, as we predicted it would be, from all this overspending, hyperinflation, that we'd either get a strong man, Mussolini style, or we'd get some sort of communism. And now, at least, there are the competing ideas. There's smart people, loud people, people with big platforms that have been pushing convincingly the fact that we should have had free markets this whole time, and in fact, an entirely free society. And so at least that idea, I think, will be in the mix if things were to collapse.
I really do admire like Curtis Yarvin for being like, you got to think of this in decades rather than like years. And I think if, the conditions were that, we had like a monetary collapse during the millennial generation being, up and coming, then maybe you have an argument for like socialism, seriously. But I don't know. I do believe that the Zoomers are more conservative. The alternative media is more pro market based, and they just, the propaganda is so stale and dry and bullshit and not exciting. And like, that's the thing, is like being woke was really rebellious to your parents, but not in Berkeley, not now. And so
now you're just a Puritan who has funny colored hair. What the hell?
Exactly. And so we do have like examples like Javier Milei, who's a badass anarcho-capitalist. I think you're just going to see more of that. Like, I just think, where socialism could have prevailed, it has missed its mark. No, like, there's still socialists, of course, but like, it's so stale. And now anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism and freedom are really manifesting, I believe. And I think we'll see more of that. And that excites me the most. I remember just even having a conversation with my favorite artist. And he is, well, I mean, he's my favorite artist, so I admire him. But we're talking about like anarcho-capitalism. He's like, that's based. And I'm like, I think so too. I'm like, damn. And I mean, he has like, a couple 100,000 like followers or listeners. And so it's like, damn, like the art industry, I feel like, is changing in culture to being actually wanting freedom.
If we can get that shift, we've won.
I mean, that's what I'm talking about. Like Renato Moicano, the UFC fighter who won, and is talking to Joe Rogan, and just like, if you love your country, read Ludwig von Mises. It's like, you're gonna have more of those things. I totally believe it. People, because it's intellectually hungry. If you're intellectually hungry, you're gonna seek out the hard shit, and the hard shit is not Marx. It's Mises.
Amen. Well, all right, Matt, given that the subject matter for today was so dark, I think that's a wonderfully bright point to leave it. We'll see if we can link to that PDF of your thesis. And we'll definitely link to the Carl Menger Institute for Market Economics, who I hope will have a very bright future. Do you want to tell people where else they can reach you on the X or the Twits or the Gram?
I'm really not on Twitter. Instagram, vacuous_vocation, and YouTube, Matthew James Geiger, posting podcasts and lectures and everything nice in between. But Adam, thank you so much. You're beautiful, and I really appreciate this.
My pleasure, Matt. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for listening to Human Nature.